This is time that we discuss a few writers like G.K.Chesterton and Saki. So before we embark on Georgian poetry, and after Saki we come to find the Georgian poetry, and there are a few poets like Robert Graves, Rupert Brooke, W.H. Davis, Walter D. Lamere, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, John Masefield, D.S. Lawrence, and the others. And these are people belonging to the Georgian poetry. And Georgian poetry follows after G.K. Chesterton and Saki. And this is time that we discuss G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton was originally called Gilbert Keith Chesterton, a popular poet, playwright, philosopher, essayist, and he was also a Catholic theologian. And he is often regarded as the Prince of Paradox, and we come to find that there are a lot of paradoxes in his writings. And his dialogues are often very interesting, like the dialogues of Oscar Wilde. And he is called the Prince of Paradox, and well known for his fictional priest detective fiction. Chesterton is mainly known for his priest detective fiction known as Father Brown stories. He is mainly popular for his Father Brown stories. And in the Father Brown stories, there is a priest detective who is called Father Brown. And he is a priest detective. And there are many number of stories written by G.K. Chesterton in the group of Father Brown stories, very interesting detective stories, read by children all over the world, and it is a favorite of children, the Father Brown stories. And Chesterton is mainly popular for his Father Brown stories. And he was also a close friend of George Bernard Shaw. It was at the time there was George Bernard Shaw also, and Chesterton was a close friend of George Bernard Shaw. And Bernard Shaw was actually a friendly enemy to Chesterton, both a friend and an enemy. Bernard Shaw seemed to be both a friend and an enemy. And Chesterton was also a close friend of Hilaire Belloc. Chesterton co-authored with Hilaire Belloc. Many of his stories were co-authored with another writer named Hilaire Belloc. And it was Bernard Shaw who called the combination as Chester Belloc. Chester is actually Chesterton, and then Belloc is Hilaire Belloc. Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton joined together in producing many stories. And the combination between these two writers, referred to by George Bernard Shaw as Chester Belloc. So in fact it will denote these two people. Bernard Shaw used to refer to them as Chester Belloc. And the reason why he called them Chester Belloc was that they voiced against capitalism, and they criticized socialism, and they insisted for distributism. And it was this reason Bernard Shaw called them Chester Belloc. They joined together in writing many of the stories. And Hilaire Belloc was a very close friend of G.K. Chesterton. And these two people are often called Chester Belloc. And Chesterton was a man of great witticism. He often used it to speak witticism, interesting comments. And Chesterton was a large man, a very heavy man. He was more than 6 feet high, and he weighed about 130 kilograms. And on meeting George Bernard Shaw once, he interestingly remarked to Bernard Shaw, to look at you, anyone would think a famine had struck England. Bernard Shaw was not a heavy man. And on finding Bernard Shaw, Chesterton interestingly remarked, to look at you, anyone would think that England was struck by poverty, that a famine had struck England. It was an interesting comment made by Chesterton or George Bernard Shaw. He commented that on seeing Bernard Shaw, people may think that England has been faced with a poverty, that England has been faced with starvation. Because the figure of Bernard Shaw will show the people the feeling that he has been living in a country where there is famine. Bernard Shaw was quite an ordinary person in his physique, not a very heavy man. But Chesterton was a heavy man. He was more than 6 feet tall and weighed about 130 kilograms. And Bernard Shaw very interestingly commented. Shaw was also a man of great witticism. When Chesterton commented George Bernard Shaw, to see him, people may think that England has been struck with poverty. And Bernard Shaw interestingly retorted that to see Chesterton, anyone would think that the starvation was caused by Chesterton. So to look at you, anyone would think you have caused the starvation. The starvation was caused by Chesterton. Chesterton was a heavy man. Very interestingly, he made a remark on George Bernard Shaw that people may think that the country is stuck with the starvation. And interestingly, Bernard Shaw retorted that anyone who would find Chesterton would think that Chesterton was the cause for the starvation. Chesterton being a heavy man and Bernard Shaw looked a medium-sized person. So, Chesterton is known for his witticisms. Bernard Shaw is also very popular for his witticism, interesting remarks. And there are about 80 books written by G.K. Chesterton, and he produced hundreds of poems and 200 short stories. And there are also 4,000 essays written by him, including several plays. And most of his works have a Christian theme. As far as Chesterton is concerned, most of his works have a Christian theme. For example, his autobiographical book, Orthodoxy, it was published in 1908, speaking about Chesterton's spiritual journey and actually how he has been turned to become a Catholic, the story of his Christian conversion. So he is described in his debate book, Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy was published by him in 1908. And then there was a very interesting book written by him, The Man Who Was Thursday. So once you asked the question to identify the name of the author for the book, The Man Who Was Thursday. So it's a very interesting title. The Man Who Was Thursday. The man is named Thursday. And it has got a subtitle also, A Nightmare. The Man Who Was Thursday, A Nightmare. And this book was also published in 1908, written in the form of a novel. The Man Who Was Thursday was written in the form of a novel. And it can be described as a metaphysical thriller. And there we come to find the protagonist, Lucian Gregory. And he is an anarchist priest. And he becomes the member of a secret central council, and there are 7 members. The story of Lucian Gregory. Gregory is the protagonist. And he is actually an anarchist poet. And he becomes member of a secret council which consisted of 7 members. And the members are called by the name of days. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on. And Gregory was called Thursday. And the story of Lucian Gregory described in the novel, The Man Who Was Thursday. And it has got a subtitle also, A Nightmare. G.K.Chesterton actually came out with a critical book called Charles Dickens, a critical study. So it was written by G.K.Chesterton. A critical study on Charles Dickens was produced by him in 1906. And very soon he came out with his book, detective fiction stories, called the Father Brown Stories. And there are 53 stories included in the Father Brown Stories. And the character was loosely based on Father John O'Connor, an Irish parish priest, who was instrumental in Chesterton's conversion. Actually, it was he who tried to convert Chesterton to Catholic belief. And Chesterton turned to become a Catholic in 1922. And most of his books have a theological concern, especially his Catholic conversion influenced him to write the theological books. And the character in Father Brown Stories is modeled on an Irish priest named Father John O'Connor. And he was instrumental in making the conversion to Catholicism. He was instrumental in making Chesterton convert to Catholic belief. And Chesterton turned to become a Catholic in 1922. And Father Brown is actually the protagonist of all these stories. There are 53 detective stories written by Father Brown. And Brown makes his first appearance in the story called The Blue Cross. The Blue Cross seemed to be the first story in the group of the Father Brown stories. And Father Brown is assisted by a reformed criminal. Father Brown identifies the criminals, and he is actually functioning as a detective. And he identifies the criminals and don't bring them to law, don't put them in the jail, but try to reform them, try to make them better people. And in his story, The Blue Cross, also we come to find his attempt to convert a criminal named Mr. Flambeau. And Flambeau became an assistant to Father Brown in his future detective work. Father Brown is found doing his detective work, identifying the criminals and trying to reform them. And the first story is The Blue Cross. And there he transforms a criminal named Hercule Flambeau. Hercule Flambeau. Hercule Flambeau was a criminal, and he was turned to become a reformed man. And he became an assistant to Father Brown. And Chesterton is also familiar with Indian mythology and Indian spiritual beliefs. And very famously, he wrote an introduction for Harindranath Maitra's Hinduism, the Veiled Ideal. Hinduism, the Veiled Ideal was a great theological book written by Harindranath Maitra. And Chesterton became influenced by the Indian spiritual concepts, and he produced an introduction to Harindranath Maitra's book, Hinduism, the Veiled Ideal.